Hello, my name is Douglas Comer. This is day 2 of our conference and symposium entitled Looking at World Heritage at 50. We will continue now with our discussion about the past, present, and future of the World Heritage Convention in the USA and around the world. As we spoke about yesterday, we live in a world much different from that of 50 years ago. The World Heritage Convention has accomplished a great deal in those 5 decades, but faces challenges, including discord among regional political blocs, and even the threat of global conflict that seem to have been relegated to the past. At the same time, we have the advantage of our increasing awareness and sensitivity to cultural differences and the emerging resolve to employ this awareness on behalf of social justice and greater social cohesion. So, welcome back to those who joined us yesterday for day 1 of our observation, celebration, and discussion of the World Heritage Convention. And to those who joined the collaborative session presented beginning yesterday morning by the United States National Parks Service World Heritage Site Managers Forum. The inaugural National Park Service Site Managers Forum continued this morning and has just concluded. It was enormously interesting and informative. And it convincingly demonstrated not just the pivotal role that the National Park Service played in the formulation and ratification of the World Heritage Convention, but also the role that it can play to move ahead with the realization of the goals and objectives presented in the convention. Now, like the U.S. Declaration of Independence and Constitution, the convention should be seen as an aspirational document. These documents created a path forward towards social justice and institutionalizing diversity. Continuing along these pathways is essential to the peace and prosperity that we all seek, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. I should mention, I usually introduce myself as president of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. Now, as I say this, I would like to invite you to our closing today, where we will announce a new name for our national committee, one that conveys more clearly our role and operation than does the name by which we have been known for many years. But rest assured, we will still be the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, regardless of the name change, the first national committee formed by ICOMOS. The National Park Service Managers Forum has also presented a playbook on how World Heritage Sites can employ World Heritage Site status for economic and social benefit. Such benefit is essential to developing local, regional, and national support, as well as support from international organizations, which are very important in other World Heritage Sites across the world. Without local support, sustainability of the integrity and authenticity of the criteria that were employed to establish outstanding universal value, the value required to inscribe a site on the World Heritage List, that's impossible without that local support. We particularly applaud the emphasis placed now on involvement of Indigenous groups who bring the kind of intimate knowledge, the lived and accumulated experience that is increasingly acknowledged to be essential to both preventing environmental damage and the accompanying destructive cultural damage of that degradation, and also to remediating that damage while this might still be possible. Now, we're late to realize this, but interestingly and importantly, I think, this is a realization that has now become front and center in what have been called the hard sciences. This is a global trend now. And I've seen this in the announcement for conferences ranging from that of the Ocean Science Societies to even the International Geoscience and Remote Sensing Society. With that, it is my honor to introduce Charles F. Sams III, also known as Chuck Sams, the Director of the National Park Service. He was sworn in as 19th Director on December 16, 2021, by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. Sams most recently served as Oregon Governor Kate Brown appointee to the Pacific Northwest Power and Conservation Council, where he held a position as a council member from March to December of 2021. Prior to joining the Northwest Council, he served as Executive Director for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Director Sams is Cayusa and Walla Walla, and is an enrolled member of the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Northeast Oregon, where he grew up. And he also has blood ties to the Kokopah tribe and Yankton Sioux of Fort Peck. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce comments by Director Sams. Thank you.
Good day, friends and relatives. My name is Chuck Sams. I'm the National Park Service Director. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person today, but I wanted to say hello and thank you for all you are doing, especially this year as we honor 50 years of the World Heritage Convention. We continue to believe in the value of the World Heritage Program and its premise that key sites are the common heritage of humanity, and that we should all, as a global community, work together to ensure their preservation. Thank you again, and I hope to join you in the future.
Afternoon, everybody. This is Destry Jarvis. I'm Vice President of US ICOMOS, and it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Mike Reynolds, the Deputy Director of the National Park Service, recently returned to that position. Mike is a multi-generational Park Service employee. His father, John, was the Deputy Director of the Park Service in the 90s and was my boss at that time when I was Assistant Director. Mike has most recently been the Intermountain Regional Director of the Park Service. And Mike, at the risk of embarrassing you, I have to tell one story. Mike, when he was acting director of the Park Service at the very end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration, he was the recipient of a phone call directly from President Trump shortly after the inauguration, wanting photographs of the crowd to prove that his crowd was bigger than Barack Obama's had been. And shortly after that, Mike was regional director in the Intermountain region. But we're glad to have him back in Park Service headquarters, I must say. He's always been a problem solver and manages to move from crisis to crisis with plum and intellect. So Mike, glad to have you here.
Thank you, Destry, very much. And I guess my best advice to all of you sisters and brothers in this good cause is that you shouldn't worry about counting people that visit. You should just count on the quality. That's my advice. It is an honor to be with you for this important gathering, highlighting a milestone anniversary. We heard briefly from Director Sams, and he did dispatch me to make sure I came with you so that we could talk in person and that the Park Service could show its commitment and its desire for ICOMOS and World Heritage to grow. Reflecting on 50 years of history of the World Heritage Convention, it's appropriate to recall that the NPS has a long history of involvement and support for World Heritage. In the early 1970s, as I think you all spoke about earlier, the director of the NPS Office of International Affairs was one of the members of the negotiating party that helped draft the text of the World Heritage Convention. And today, the Office of International Affairs, that is still with us in the Park Service, under the direction of the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, who is Shannon Estenos, leads the U.S. participation in the convention, including overseeing nominations of U.S. sites. Of course, the U.S. was the first signatory and hosted the first meeting in 1978, at which sites were inscribed on the World Heritage List, including Mesa Verde in Colorado and Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming and Montana, making a point by nominating both a cultural and a natural heritage site. In recent years, we have successfully inscribed the first mixed U.S. site recognized for both natural and cultural values, specifically for its significance to Native Hawaiians. The Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. My apologies to Native Hawaiians if I butchered that. Our most recent nomination is exciting. It's the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks in Ohio, an extraordinary series of earthen enclosures in very precise geometric shapes, and they were built by Native Americans 2,000 years ago. It is added to the World Heritage List this summer. If it is, it will be the 25th U.S. site to have that honor. Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma is on the steering committee for this nomination, which has been widely embraced by tribal nations and endorsed by the National Congress of American Indians. World Heritage, therefore, is more than a list. It is also a network of sites and countries who cooperate with each other to help protect these cherished places of global and cultural significance. NPS, through this aforementioned our International Affairs Office, who you'll meet today, Mr. Steve Morris, and through initiatives at the park level, actively pursues this cooperation. Just last month, for example, in concert actually with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Lower Elwha Clallam Tribe in Washington State, we hosted a workshop in Olympic National Park, a World Heritage Site, on how parks and protected area managers can work better with Indigenous peoples in safeguarding these special places. The workshop included Indigenous representatives from Chile, Mexico, Canada, and the US, and some other World Heritage sites around the globe. We in the National Park Service continue to believe in the value of the World Heritage Program, whose premise is that these key sites are the common heritage of humanity, and that we should all, as a global community, work together to ensure their preservation. Given the conflicts facing our world today, but also the promise of a more inclusive and just society and world, World Heritage, ICOMOS, all of you, and our places that we steward or attempt to steward are even more important than ever. Those are the formal remarks that the Assistant Secretary and the National Park Service wanted to speak to you about today. I'd like to add a few from my own experience with you all and in my role as a key aide to Director Sams. We have talked to the director often about how we in the National Park Service can do a better job moving forward in our government to government responsibilities with tribal nations and Indigenous people. And he's very eloquent in how he describes different ways we can do it. He is a lawyer by training, so sometimes he morphs into law. But at other times, it can be a very simple premise. He's instructed many of us in senior leadership ranks to encourage our superintendents and all of us to simply invite tribes more to the table and to simply listen, but really listen. Listen to what is meaningful to them, what is important, not necessarily come with prejudgments, and do this frequently. Not to treat what we call in this country tribal consultation as simply a meeting or a memo or a phone call or a checking of the box, but a meaningful dialogue and a deeper understanding. There are so many different ways that we could talk about this in more technical detail, but he often defaults to the simple matter that we sometimes do not, as public land, park, heritage area stewards, think to involve tribes at that deeper level and simply have them at the table frequently and often and in different places. So we are trying to do that. We are working on a co-stewardship strategy. And what we mean by co-stewardship, at least in our parlance right now, is ways that we can have a tribe join us and Indigenous peoples join us in many different ways. And I can answer some questions on that as best I can. It is a nascent and early on attempt at upping our game, as they say, but I'm more than happy to talk to you all about that. One thing that I would just highlight that I believe other speakers have probably touched on is traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, is something that we're very much interested in deepening our practice, our understanding of it, and combining that with the Western sciences in both cultural and natural history. And so TEK is one of these things in co-stewardship that we are venturing in on. And I was just recently reviewing a project in Acadia National Park where Indigenous TEK has been mixed with our botanists, if you will, to look at sawgrass growth and harvest. And in the plots that the Indigenous tribal folks have been helping us with TEK, there are sometimes 3 to 5 degrees more density than what our traditional science projects are for this grass, which is an important thing traditionally for them. And so we think that there's not only evidence, but also great promise in the combining of our efforts to steward these places. And so I would encourage all of us that have World Heritage and otherwise protected areas to also share in this journey. And so with that, Destry, that's kind of the thoughts that we wanted to share with you today. And I'd be more than happy to have some conversation with some folks if we have some time to do that.
Great, Mike. Thank you very much. So this morning, I learned something in the managers forum that I didn't know, which is that Mesa Verde, which was inscribed in 1978, in 2014 had reviewed its OUVs, Outstanding Universal Values, and done what they called a retrospective statement of those, which is a good thing, I think. You know, of the 24 U.S. World Heritage Sites, 19 are units of the National Park System. And of those, at least 12 are natural areas that were inscribed only for their natural values. But every one of those had, in the past, strong association and occupation, in many cases, by Native American people. We at US ICOMOS believe that those cultural values, those heritage values, those Indigenous people values need to be acknowledged somehow within the World Heritage inscription. And since, although it just came up, this idea of a retrospective statement of OUVs seems like possibly a fairly simple, straightforward way without going back and amending the full inscription dossier to get started with that and give the Park Service, let the World Heritage Sites in the park system be a leader in your co-stewardship approach. Many of those are what have been in the past called the crown jewels to begin with. Many of those were under your supervision in the Intermountain region. You had 7 World Heritage Sites there. So what do you think about some approach to enhancing or expanding or acknowledging those cultural values in those World Heritage Parks?
I think it's a great idea. I think the one thing that I often am looking for, at least in our conversations, is each site's going to be unique. Each relationship that it has in terms of history or current with tribal or Indigenous folk. But if we could start doing something that's all together. So what you described there, Destry, is something that we could do across the board at many sites. We could ask everybody to do that research, to pull up those acknowledgements, to bring in, as I was speaking earlier, in a consultation sense, a government to government sense, the tribes involved, and do these different acknowledgements, perhaps in different ways that match the site. But if we had something that was more comprehensive like that, I think part of the beauty of that is it's not just the acknowledgement or the celebration, if you will, or the public unveiling of something like that. It would be the course of relationship building and development that would also form in places that haven't looked at their histories. And just about every one of our 423 plus sites have that history. So I think it's a great idea. I think we could make it a programmatic ask, and we could do something that would be scalable to different parks.
Great. And before Steve Morris jumps all over me for burdening his office, his understaffed office, with too much work, I think this is something that the individual World Heritage sites could very well do themselves as they reach out to their culturally affiliated tribes and ask them, those tribal members, to help them define those OUVs in cultural terms.
Yeah, very much so. And one thing I wanted to acknowledge that, and in fact, it's ironic we're having this conversation. I'm coming to you from Chicago, Illinois today, and I'm here to meet with different funders that are interested in programs in the National Park Service. And one of the things we'll talk about this weekend is that some of our work with tribes and indigenous communities right now, the tribes themselves tell us, as do folks in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and others, that capacity for these tribes to interact and meet us part way would be very, very helpful to grow. And so we talk about capacity building and international work, I know, all the time, but we're also very much interested in helping tribes build up with any combination of staffing or interns or grants somehow. And we're trying to figure out how to do that through our legal and otherwise mechanisms, and encourage others to do that. So I wanted to acknowledge as well that when we come up with these ideas, sometimes we might also need to think and open up dialogue with our tribal partners right away about what help they might need in order to do this the right way, right?
You bet. And while I know that you're not the final word on your budget by any means, the Park Service has the responsibility currently to fund the tribal historic preservation offices
Yes.
with an annual grant. It is an underfunded piece of your budget, as you well know. And you could start by increasing the budget grant to those tribal historic preservation officers who are associated with the World Heritage Parks, to enable them to undertake this expansion of the OUVs, for one thing. I'm sure they have lots to do, but that would be one usable project that they could undertake.
Yeah. I want to make this exciting for your viewers. So, Destry didn't warn me about putting me on the spot on any of these things. So you're getting to see live government in action here, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm agreeing with you. That's the problem, Destry. I'm agreeing with you right now. It's probably going to get me in trouble. But all joking aside, we are working on that very issue. Joy Beasley is our cultural resources manager, our associate director, a wonderful human being that has that interest along with her staff. But also there are some opportunities. I mean, sometimes I usually show up as a Park Service person over the last 30 something years and say, we never have enough money. Ironically, right now, there is some really good news on some of the money front. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Great America Outdoor Act, the Land Resources Fund of that. They have brought some resources here, mostly on deferred maintenance, but the Inflation Reduction Act actually has a lot to do with climate, with resilience, with restoration. And we're trying to look at that both from a natural and a cultural history lens, as well as, if you will, a tribal lens. And so, Destry, there might be some opportunities in that. It's not the silver bullet, as they say, but it's the beginnings of us being able to attack it in a different way. There's close to $500,000, right? It's been made available to share among the different land management bureaus and DOI that I'm aware of, which is all in the forming and storming stage right now.
Yeah, you did say $500 million, right?
If I didn't, that's what I meant. Yes, 500 million. It's a lot.
Yeah, right. It is. And although the the AGO Act funding was directed at deferred maintenance of facilities, certainly some of those facilities are historic, and I would say some of those are historic landscapes that are appropriately co-stewarded with culturally affiliated tribes, because their livelihood in many cases historically, and certainly many of their traditional gathering practices, occurred in those landscapes as part of their culture.
Very much so. And you could make all kinds of connections that I'm not being very specific here, but if you're looking at restoration, resilience, and climate action in Yellowstone, somehow that same thing, that thread that you just described can pull all the way back to how we might be providing bison to tribal, surplus bison in Yellowstone every year. It is a species that needs to be culled, if you will. And rather than a violent cull, you could actually pass this off to tribes, for which we've been trying to do in smaller numbers than should happen, right? So you can make these connections and find funding for that kind of thing through these programs.
Yeah. When Doug Comer and I met with Director Sams a few months ago, before you moved back to Washington, we talked about the fact that the AGO money going to deferred maintenance was also covering an awful lot of the World Heritage Site parks, in part because they are the big crown jewels that have been around a long time and have a lot of deferred maintenance. And why not take credit, if you will, in the World Heritage context, that you are indeed restoring and funding these World Heritage sites up front and as part of a notable, separable, announceable part of the AGO program. I haven't seen, we hear from managers, all the time that, they don't get anything out of being a World Heritage site. And while that's overblown to some extent, there's also an element of truth to it. And so we keep looking for ways to give them a reason to want to be a World Heritage site or to be proud of being a World Heritage site that some of them don't always or readily acknowledge.
I agree. And having worked at some of these places, I mean, there is usually always a core set of staff that are not only aware of it, they actively are working on it, even if they're somewhat offline from maybe what is the current issues of the day in that park or protected area. But there's always a passion, and there's always a group that carries that passion and stays connected all the way up our line to Steve Morris and to others. And I think that we should, it's a poor term, it's a business term, but I think we need to rebrand a little bit with World Heritage and really make ourselves aware of it. I could see, the director's office, for example, highlighting it much more internally to focus on a certain day, for example, or to tie us all together on phone calls. I'm thinking of my friend on this call, Superintendent Christine Jacobson, and her work at San Antonio, and she's got a strong communications ability, and we've had a lot of those conversations about how you've got to get the word out.
Absolutely,
because it's exciting. I mean, communities are excited by that, and I also think that helps to build that kind of support for World Heritage that we desperately need right now.
Yeah. Well, one example that's near and dear to my heart of tribal engagement has been at Redwood National and State Parks in California. A few years ago when I was actually working for the Yurok tribe, there was commercial fishing on the beach, gathering with nets of surf fish, small herring-like fish, by commercial fishermen, but the tribe was not allowed to do that, even though they traditionally had gathered on the beaches. So that got fixed with an amendment in legislation. But then the tribe, by policy, was not allowed to dry the fish on the beach. They had to take it home or to inland up the Klamath River, where the drying conditions lacked the salt air ability to improve the drying of those fish. Well, the park administratively changed that policy and allowed them to do that after some time.
Encouragement.
It's encouragement. And that's a good thing. I mean, recognizing those values. There was also a time in the past when the tribe traditionally carved whole log redwood canoes. And I watched an elder do that a number of times when I was there. But the park had a policy that the tribe could have a fallen redwood if it fell in a storm, only if it fell across a road, and only a piece of log as long as the road was wide, which I thought was totally ridiculous. And that policy changed as well. So there was some ability on the part of park management to learn from the tribe that these things were cultural tradition in nature. And that's been a good thing.
We look back, I think sometimes I look back to practices that we did in the past. Perhaps it was a maintenance practice or something that you're describing, and we think to ourselves nowadays, what in the world were they thinking? And I think that that's what managers in the future will look back to some of these stories, of recent past. And since we're thinking about past, present, and future at this convention, I want us to think a lot. We encourage our managers right now. What would you want folks to say about you 100 years from now? What would you be very proud of? And I think sometimes that can help accelerate our thinking towards what you're describing, Destry, because that sort of sounds almost crazy to me, right? What you just said in this day and age. But it does show you the distance that we have to go just to be real together, that there will be some policies. There will be these statements on the record. There will be presidents or directors or whatever that will push back on certain things. Park staff will push back, usually in well-meaning ways. And we have to, something Director Sams talks to me all about is we have to have the courage to step into these things. And we have to have the ability, and that's the beauty of this idea of listening and bringing tribes to the table, is they can help explain, there's a reason we dry fish on the beach. There's a reason that works that way, that we've known for hundreds or thousands of years with the salt air. And it helps, if you will, in the Western sense, steer us through the logic and the legal course that someone might to take, because we all have to recognize there are politics, right? There's probably local politics there that we're chiming on that superintendent from the other side too. So acknowledging that, we just have to be smarter about how we make these arguments sometimes.
Right.
And by the way, Redwood is now continuing that tradition because the condors have been reintroduced, and really because of tribal involvement. That, to make a long story short, the condor is an even bigger success because of their, I guess you could say, their TEK influences over the whole process.
Yes, while I was working for them, I took a team of tribal elders down to Pinnacles, which already had a condor reintroduction program in place, to get them on board, educated. They were fully on board with the idea of bringing a condor back, but they didn't know, how to do it at that point. So we got them some assistance. They saw the Park Service in action at Pinnacles, and they're busy bringing back. They hired a condor expert onto the TIPO staff, and have really been doing some great things.
Yeah.
Shifting gears slightly, back to the deferred maintenance question. Back a decade and a half ago, the parks in the W. Bush administration, the Park Service developed a facility condition index and an asset priority index to judge priorities. And at that time, pretty much all the masonry forts were dumped into the fifth band as the least or lowest priority, on the theory that masonry forts were indestructible. But one masonry fortress, San Juan and La Fortaleza, is a World Heritage Site. And it has a significant deferred maintenance backlog, largely and most recently due to sea level rise and intense storm damage. I think for the service to announce a significant restoration of that facility as a World Heritage Site deserves to be, with this deferred maintenance funding, would be a good thing to do on the merits, as well as a good PR move, so to speak, in the World Heritage context.
Yeah, I'm aware of those problems. There's an investment review board that the National Park Service has, and these projects are coming through that board. It meets almost monthly at this point. And there have been different strategies put forward. I'm not sure they have been fully funded at this point, but to your point, it's being discussed a lot. It's been being argued over in terms of what kind of technique. It's actually, probably based on traditional methods versus our modern view of the world. Who the heck knows how they built all that, right? Because it's apparently a lot harder to fix in that water environment. But it's a really cool story down there. I had the privilege of going down after Hurricane Maria, not because of that. The privilege was after I got there, and met, there's a team down there of mostly local people that are incredible masons, probably passed down through generations. And of course, in the spirit of bureaucratic problems, right? They aren't permanent employees, and there's some things that we need to really fix to make that to work better. But that all the right tools are there, is what I mean by that, and all the right people are there if we can line up the funding. But it is being talked about, Destry, heavily.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah.
So, where do you think, Mike? Where do you think the service is headed organizationally in terms of rethinking priorities in the Biden administration? Now that Chuck's got almost a year, or maybe just a little over a year, in place, and you've got a few months, but with lots of prior experience, have you begun to think about your priorities for the rest of your time in those positions?
Yeah, the political leadership is breaking things into chunks, right? What is practical to get done maybe in the next couple of years, for example, and those kind of things. But in the long haul sense, the director has about 7 basic priorities. I don't know if I could get them all off the top of my head, but I remember many of them off the top of my head. One of them is workforce. And I think managers of World Heritage, many of us are drawn to this business to be in the resource, right? Or to work for the resource. We probably over time have forgotten to invest in our people as much as and to appreciate the people, both inside the staff and around us. And that relates, of course, to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, but also, if you will, to our relationships all the way up to tribes. But that's a really large focus for us right now, is we often use some what might seem euphemistic terms about empowering the workforce and some things like that. But really, we're trying to solve a lot of morale problems, and we're trying to think about equity, and we're trying to think about how folks can get involved in the Park Service more. And then the other thing that's might seem a little bit narrow, but it is all related, is housing is a huge issue. And so we've got a lot of focus on some of those practical things. On the more broader kind of topics, a lot about co-stewardship, as we've talked about extensively, and a lot about exploring that in a much more in-depth way about how we can raise all of our boats and all of our dignity, if you will, by bringing everyone that should have been at the table for the last 100 years to the table. But also large landscape work, this idea of climate change. I have been just shocked in my last position just a few months ago, dealing with the Colorado River and dealing with a fundamental shift in how that system is working. And I know with ICOMOS, the tie to that is then what's happening to places like you mentioned, Destry and San Juan, or at the forts, and what it's doing to our structures. I was in June, I had the privilege of being invited to Santa Fe to the Terra conference, which is an international body of earth and structure experts, and sat in on some really interesting things. And this is happening around the world: the impacts of climate, the impacts of weather, the impacts of heat. So we're focused a lot on the climate situation, which then leads us to thinking about restoration and resiliency, which lines us up with the funding that I mentioned earlier. So those are some of our big topic items. I think also we are exploring the equity, inclusion, and access and justice themes. And it's not just about parks that might get created for that. So think of civil rights parks or something like that, Selma to Montgomery, but also how to be the kind of places into that 100-year future that we were talking about, into the next 7 generations that people feel welcomed at, engaged with. So we think a lot about visitor experience, and we think a lot about how people are accessing and understanding parks. And that might sound somewhat traditional, but I think trying to think about it on a much deeper level and providing it in a much more modern way.
Right. I'm glad you brought up civil rights, because they're one of the tentative site nominees pending nomination to the World Heritage List is a serial multi-site nomination of civil rights movement sites, largely in the South. Although being here in Baltimore, I think Thurgood Marshall deserves some inclusion in that.
His school is where he went to school, is in your town, right?
That's right. And particularly Selma to Montgomery. I know the secretary was down there recently. It's a National Historic Trail, and as such, National Historic Trails don't get very much funding. But as a consequence, there's been virtually no land acquisition along that trail corridor. And I think the service has also, in addition to deferred maintenance money, there's a whole lot of land and water conservation money now not subject to annual appropriation levels. So I think there's some of those sites, the Park Service has appropriately a requirement for World Heritage nominations that they be permanently preserved prior to nomination. And I think the Seminole Montgomery corridor, whether it's a National Historic Trail or a National Historic Park, could be and should be in that nomination if some of the land along it, some of the campsites, for example, are preserved, at least with easements. We've been working with folks down there. The owners seem desirous of having their farms preserved, stay in their ownership, so easements are probably appropriate. But I think a close look at opportunities to protect some of these civil rights sites is a very timely thing to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up there. So I should have mentioned the funding in Land and Water Conservation Fund. And if you're not familiar with it, most of you probably are, but it's split into two different pots. We call it the federal and the state side, just to make it simple. The federal side is what Destry just mentioned, the land acquisition authorities. And the dollar amounts, I can't remember off the top of my head, but let's just say they've almost quadrupled with the Dingle Act, reauthorizing land and water, and then some recent legislation that's given it permanent funding. First time really that's ever had the permanency that it deserves. And the state side has also been bumped up. So in the state side, we were giving, under $100 million out, I think it's up to $300 million a year that we can give to communities around the country. And I think LWCF is a very, very misunderstood and underappreciated way that we can touch parks and touch people in every community in the United States. It's a weird grant that it doesn't have anything to do with normal park operations and management. It has to do with us being a pass-through and a manager of grants to the states, then to communities to help preserve. And why I'm bringing all this up is it's what Destry talks about. We have a lot more ability to buy easements and lands and negotiate these things that we should put into permanent protection of various kinds. But we also have a way to start linking what might seem trivial in some cases or non-nationally significant, like parks for people in park deserts in communities. But if we were doing a better job and more thoughtful about how that links all the way to a Yellowstone or a Grand Canyon over time, or how we link using those kind of tools to help people in Mississippi or Alabama talk about the Selma to Montgomery Trail better. We've got the opportunities there. We just sometimes silo ourselves, and we need to broaden ourselves and our connectivity on these sources of funding to string them together. So this is exciting. This is actually more exciting time than I've seen in so long. And I think we haven't quite appreciated how much funding is starting to become available for this that we need to take advantage of. We need to build capacity because the good and bad news is when you get a large sum of money like this rather quickly, like let's just say in a year appropriation, that capacity is not there for us to obligate, and Congress gets grumpy if you don't move that money. So
right.
bring your ideas, people. That's my message to us. We need to bring the ideas. We are actually, to give you scale, we're hiring close to 100 people to implement this new funding at the LWCF. It's been a program that has hovered with maybe 20 to 30 people. And so it shows you the scale that and the understanding of what we need to do to ramp up to help move that money, if you will, to the communities. But it's a terribly important connection that could be made to build, right? So it wouldn't have to necessarily become a World Heritage Site or a national park right off the bat. But if we're thoughtful about purchasing and preserving civil rights sites before they're lost, before they're destroyed, even if they're just somewhat in limbo until they build up into a bigger story, that's the kind of thinking that I'm excited about.
Well, Mike, you've taken an extraordinary amount of time for a guy who's on the road and not sitting in the comfort of your office. I don't want to hold you beyond what's fair, and I appreciate how much time you've given us today. So I'm going to stop my questioning. I've been looking at the chat and the Q&A box to see if we've got anything. And I don't see anything specific that's a question for you beyond what we've already talked about.
Well, that's fine, Destry. It's been an honor, and I really appreciate the casual conversation with you as well. And what I would offer to folks is if you do have questions and thoughts afterwards, or as you go through your program, you can get a hold of me and I'd be more than happy to talk to you. My email is the Michael_Reynolds at nps.gov, Michael_Reynolds.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Great to see you.
Thanks, Destry. You too. Thank you.
So we're going to move right into the next panel. It's actually going to be several individual presentations followed by a bit of discussion, Q&A at the end. So I'm going to ask John Adornato to come on and get us started. You know, we're talking now in the present of the World Heritage sites around the U.S. And in particular, some threats that seriously need attention. So, John, take it away.
Thank you, Destry. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and I hope I do it right. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. Well, what a privilege to be here, and thank you. Been listening in on these past couple of days of presentations, and there's so much opportunity. These places are so amazing. And let me back up a second before I jump into it all. But my name is John Adornato. I'm the Deputy Vice President of Regional Programs for National Parks Conservation Association. I've been with NPCA for over 20 years and was for quite a long time down in South Florida working on Everglades restoration and the amazing parks down there and that amazing World Heritage Site. NPCA, for those of you who don't know us, we are America's leading voice for our national parks. We bring people to these discussions, people who love and care for their parks and want to be involved in their future. And so we're very much the advocacy watchdog organization, not the management side of things. And so we bring, I'm going to bring, and my colleague Ernie next will bring some of that outside perspective and advocacy toward those futures. And parks really are economic drivers, tourist destinations, and with so many of the World Heritage sites managed by the Park Service, we know that these additional designations really add to the appeal of tourists. World Heritage designation adds to my appeal when I go internationally and visit some of these amazing places. And yet, as we talked about yesterday, there isn't necessarily a mechanism for a hammer mechanism for better management, et cetera, or other tools. And so we have to rely on that self sort of identification. And national parks really serve as an anchor for their ecosystem. They don't exist as islands, and though more and more they are becoming just that. I'm reminded in these discussions about the Park Service's role in the management, and yet all of these other federal agencies and other governmental bodies, state, local, tribal entities, directly affect these parks, their resources, and therefore their use by visitors. And so better coordination, as I'll explain, is needed. And so while some of these examples aren't necessarily positive, I think that what the opportunity is really to celebrate that World Heritage designation, especially in those sites that are endangered, and bring the context of large landscape conservation, including the global effort to protect 30% of the world's lands by 2030. And so we're really pleased that the Biden administration has celebrated and advanced the America the Beautiful response to that effort. So again, I'm going to quickly go through some examples and then just kind of bring it together at the end. Grand Canyon, amazing and beautiful spot. Yet uranium mining threatens its preservation, as does forest management outside of the park. Uranium mining interests have over 600 active mining claims, over 1 million acres of land, and only 0.2% of the identified uranium resources are located on public lands that are now protected by the ban. And so the solution there, from one perspective, is legislation to ensure that that ban becomes permanent, or even a national monument designation. But all told, we really need to work together. The agencies really need to work together to ensure that the Park Service's main role of protecting these places under both the Organic Act, as well as under the Convention and the World Heritage designation, is paramount. We go to Carlsbad, Caverns, oil and gas drilling, such a significant threat. And as I'm so pleased about what Mike was saying earlier in the conversation, really emphasizing tribal engagement. The landscape around Carlsbad Caverns is characterized by unique cave and karst ecosystems, which extend far beyond the park's boundaries. Parts of the intricate subterranean cavern system are interconnected with the aquifer for nearby communities. And the region is home to the biodiverse Chihuahuan desert ecosystems and habitat on the surface. Of course, the landscape also offers unique outdoor recreational experiences. But if existing proposed areas of critical environmental concern and additional particularly fragile karst areas are protected from rampant oil and gas development occurring in the permanent basin, we need to safeguard these critical resources. And so it's solved by the Bureau of Land Management withdrawing these resources from oil and gas leases, similar to what's happened around Chaco Culture National Historic Park, and my colleague Ernie is going to talk about that a little bit more. The same sort of threats are there at Mesa Verde, oil and gas development. How do we manage for and work with the sister agencies of the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, et cetera, on these publicly owned lands? Because either they're going to contribute to climate change or serve as a model for landscape preservation, tribal engagement, carbon mitigation, and the rest of the America the Beautiful goals. Yellowstone, boy, there's a theme here. Oil and gas, and certainly if any of us were driving around today, we know the challenges of the cost of gas and the reality that this is. But there remain challenges that we need to work together and collaborate with, because this international mecca of awe-inspiring landscape and amazing wildlife under threat from that lack of collaboration. And so we prefer that BLM and the U.S. Forest Service address those resource management challenges with a multi-jurisdictional plan or vision. So coming together for agreed upon set of goals would really benefit all of these. I mean, in Yellowstone alone, 22 million acres, 3 states, 2 national parks, 3 wildlife refuges, 5 national forests, 3 BLM state offices, 20 counties, private and state lands, and tribal entities. It's a challenge that needs to really take a focused approach. Glacier, Waterton, we talked, well, all of these sites have been talked about these past couple of days, a large landscape, yet even the park is saying that they have to get the broader issues of coordination under control. Coordination with regard to the Forest Service activities. What we're seeing more and more, in fact, NPCA is trying to drill down on how we can support the Park Service and the other agencies in recreational activities. Visitation skyrocketed during the pandemic, but it was already on an increasing trajectory. How do these parks manage for those challenges, those new challenges? And like Mike said, welcoming the next generation of park users who have different expectations, different ways in which they want to experience these places. We really need to have a collaborative approach, not just the Park Service, but with all of the federal agencies. The Everglades, spent a lot of time there. It is an amazing and beautiful place created exactly for its biodiversity and unique ecology. Long on the World Heritage Site, followed by being listed on the endangered site. A little bit of a roller coaster ride there, talked about yesterday. Such great stories of success in these past few years, decade really, plus since the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was approved in 2000 and even before. Great coordination, yet still Everglades National Park is threatened by poor water quality, quantity, timing, and distribution of its life-giving water. While EPA has been a critical leader since forever, since the early 90s, there still looms the concern of water quality violations and the solutions that we are spending, and thanks to this Biden administration, even more money to solve. Not there yet. The Army Corps of Engineers has been an amazing partner, and I've always joked with the Assistant Secretary of the Army that they have the best relationship with any environmental group in the country because of the positive work that they're doing. But it takes a lot of work to make sure that it happens, and the funding, both the Congress and the state of Florida has ensured is there. Great Smokies, another positive relationship with the Forest Service. There is, though, still challenges with the park so fragmented and human development threats. As the climate changes, folks are moving back up out of Florida and into some of these amazing hill countries. Yet we have to address what that's going to mean for the pressure in these areas. We don't yet call them climate refugees within our own country, but those with the financial means are moving to rural counties who are poor and willing to let that money come in and not focus enough on the zoning pressures that exist. So in conclusion, I would just say that Americans love their parks. We want to work with the Park Service and the agencies to deliver partners, engage tribal members, and really work across the agencies toward large landscape conservation. World Heritage sites are obviously great opportunities to do that, with the Biden administration focusing on America the Beautiful, utilizing national parks as their anchors, and as we were just talking about, a number of funding opportunities with the Great America's Outdoors, the Inflation Reduction Act, and even some of the transportation dollars that are making a big change. If we can work across these agencies, we'll be able to deliver better results, more collaboration, and focus on what Americans want to see. They don't see the boundaries of agencies, but they see these amazing places, and they don't want them to be destroyed. So if you want to go fast, go alone. But if we all want to go further, let's go together. Thank you.
So
take questions later.
yeah, we'll do questions as a group. So Ernie Atencio, you're up next.
All right. Thanks, Destry. Thanks, John. I assume you can all see me. Looks a little blurry on my screen, but hopefully it's working. My name's Ernie Atencio, and I work with John at NPCA as a Southwest Regional Director. I live in my family homeland near Taos, New Mexico, but our Southwest region includes all of the Four Corners states and some of the richest cultural landscape in the U.S. Really spectacular country, including Chaco Canyon. So I'm going to talk about what an important site Chaco is. So, of course, talking a lot about the past, but also what's at stake from oil and gas development. And so that's really about the future. And I have a lot of slides to share because it really is so visually stunning. So let me bring my screen up here. Chaco Culture National Historical Park and World Heritage Site is truly an amazing place and definitely a globally important area. It protects a dense concentration of massive masonry structures, some of the largest in North America until about 1850. It also protects the stories of that place that still resonate with the descendants, and I think maybe some lessons for all of us. 1,000 years ago, Chaco was the center of ceremonial and political activity throughout the Four Corners region, with wide roads radiating out in all directions and connected to communities as far as Bears Ears National Monument in Southeast Utah. And it was part of a vast trade network that reached to the Toltec Empire in central Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. Chacoan people had a sophisticated understanding of the heavens, which is not surprising for agricultural people. But we see that today in precise alignments in the architecture and even with the relative placement of villages across long distances. These alignments mark solstices and equinoxes and even an 18.5-year lunar cycle. Chaco still has some of the darkest night skies in the region, and we're essentially continuing that tradition of archaeoastronomy, but in different ways today. Chaco is an international dark sky park, and they have professional grade telescopes that they put up at night that are available for visitors. After centuries of growth and development, the Chaco culture was incredibly successful and prosperous, dominating the entire region for about 300 years until around 1150 AD, when its residents started moving on to other places, including areas that today are part of Arizona and New Mexico. 21 sovereign Pueblo nations maintain strong cultural and ceremonial connections with Chaco and with the larger landscape and many additional archaeological sites and sacred sites surrounding the park. So to the point that John was making, the resources and the value contained within the boundaries of the national park, they don't magically stop at the boundary, but it continues throughout the entire region. So this area is really part of the cultural identity for these Pueblo tribes and part of their tradition to keep these connections to the ancestors alive. Since my first visit to Chaco in 1981, I have seen that landscape terribly altered and impacted by a spider web of roads and well pads and pump jacks, brightly lit processing facilities. There are noisy, heavy vehicles rolling along these rural roads, kicking up dust. What was once the center of a flourishing Puebloan culture in the Southwest is turning into an industrialized landscape. 91% of the federal lands surrounding the park are already leased for oil and gas development. Now on this map, you can see Chaco in the middle there. The black dots represent active wells. So that's not even all the leases, but just wells that are currently active. And if we zoom out, you can see the impact in the entire region. That's about 40,000 wells over this entire area. And I'd say enough is enough. Saving this irreplaceable cultural landscape from the destruction of oil and gas development has become one of NPCA's highest priorities. And we're working with a coalition that includes just about every conservation and archaeological and historic preservation organization you can imagine. But more importantly, in my mind, we work closely with and we support the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which represents 20 of the tribes who are descendants and heirs to the rich legacy of Chaco. And they have provided strong leadership and direction that we follow. We also work with a number of Navajo allies who live in the area, who after centuries there have their own ties to this landscape and other sacred sites. And in my mind, though this is a globally important area for all people, these are the people and the communities who are really at ground zero for the negative impacts of oil and gas. But we are making some progress. For several years, our coalition has been advocating for the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act. This is federal legislation that would permanently prohibit new oil and gas leases within an area of 10 miles surrounding the park and outlying sites. That's about 351,000 acres of land managed by the Federal Bureau of Land Management, as you can see here in the blue outline. It's a bit of a checkerboard of jurisdiction. There's state lands, there's tribal lands and private lands, but it's important to mention that all the tribal lands, both Navajo Nation trust lands and privately owned Navajo allotments, are exempt from this legislation. And this is something we support as a matter of tribal sovereignty and self-determination for these local communities for economic alternatives. That 10 miles is not arbitrary, but encompasses at least 4,000 known archaeological sites, including some of the largest and most important sites in the region. And that's with only about 20% of the area having been surveyed. In addition, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of tribal cultural sites that have not yet been identified and we may never even know about. Other legislative tools have been used effectively to place a moratorium on new leasing in the area until a federally funded ethnographic study for the region is completed. And that study includes both the Pueblos and local Navajos. And the New Mexico State Land Commissioner has also placed a moratorium on leasing state lands within that protection zone through the end of next year. So that's another 73,000 acres that is off the table for now. In the meantime, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who you probably know is also part of this Puebloan heritage, came to Chaco late last year to announce two important things. One is an initiative called Honoring Chaco, which Department of Interior says will convene a regional conversation, including tribes, elected officials, and other stakeholders to develop strategies to protect and celebrate Pueblo and other tribal culture in the region. So this is an important conversation that's going on right now. And she also announced the start of an administrative process to prohibit leasing for 20 years within the 10-mile zone while the legislation is still in the works. And 20 years might be enough. If we have not figured out our way out of the current fossil fuel dilemma within 20 years, I think we're really all in trouble. Still, a permanent solution to protect this globally important and sacred cultural landscape through federal legislation will make us all sleep better at night. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. We'll save the questions for the end. Now we're going to shift gears slightly to, or maybe enlarge the perspective a bit to the international scale. Our next two speakers work internationally on World Heritage. First will be Leslie Friedman from the Getty Conservation Institute, followed by a video from Nelly Robles of ICOMOS Mexico. Nelly is in the field at an archaeological site this week, but she was pleased to do a recording. So Leslie, if you could come on and take over.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Destry. Yes, my name is Leslie Friedman, and I work at the Getty Conservation Institute, or GCI, as you'll probably hear me refer to it. I am an architectural conservator, actually by training, but I focus on the conservation and management of archaeological sites and heritage, as well as cultural landscapes. So I've been at the Getty, the GCI, for over a decade now, working in this area. So thank you very much, first of all, for having me at this very important conference. I'm so pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to speak a little bit about the Getty's work in this area of climate change and heritage. As Destry mentioned, I'm going to sort of shift the focus geographically a little bit, or a lot actually, to the Mediterranean region. So I'm going to speak actually, I think quite briefly today about the GCI's current work in this area, which is really taking shape in sort of two forms currently, both dealing with archaeological heritage and sites in the Mediterranean region, particularly in the eastern part of the Mediterranean region. So first, I'll just speak briefly about a project taking place at the site, the World Heritage Site of Nea Paphos in Cyprus, which is along the western coast of Cyprus. We are developing a conservation and management plan for this site. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the project, but just to say that the impacts and effects and responses to the threats of climate change are really a major focus of this project. And that's something sort of new for us, to really integrate, looking at climate change and the impacts and threats of climate change in our conservation and management planning for sites. So we're doing this in conjunction with our partner, the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus. And I should mention that as generally as a country, Cyprus and neighboring Greece have been very involved in looking at climate change threats to the Eastern Mediterranean region, including sort of the Middle East coast. And like many sites in the Mediterranean, Nea Paphos is at great risk for sea level rise in particular, and resulting from that, erosion and coastal flooding. But this is not happening uniformly across the Mediterranean region. The eastern part of the Mediterranean region really seems to be at greater risk than the western part. But even within the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the impacts are not and will not be uniform. And so therefore, really site-specific research really needs to happen, at the local level for each World Heritage Site. And I think another one of our speakers had talked about that a little bit earlier. So for example, at Paphos, in addition to the sea level rise, there's also, of course, increasing temperatures. And one result of that has been wildfires. So actually on the site itself, a couple of years ago, we had wildfires. There were wildfires for, I think, one of the first times. Also resulting from an increase in temperatures is going to be, and is resulting in a decrease in the lack of biodiversity. And this in particular is a really important value of the site of Nea Paphos, and it really contributes to its significance. So there are very specific threats to this site resulting from climate change. And then also in the Mediterranean, I'm going to shift a little bit to actually North Africa, because we had a previous project in Tunisia at the site of Bilareja, the World Heritage Site of Bilareja. And this project really demonstrated in particular the specific risks of sites where resources are perhaps more limited, and investment in infrastructure and maintenance in infrastructure, which was also earlier discussed, has been quite minimal. And it really demonstrates the importance of that, especially when it comes to things like drainage infrastructure. Additionally, just geographically, North Africa is at major risk for climate change and sea level rise. And just for example, when I was working there up until 2015, there were successive winter flooding events. So every winter there was significant flooding, and Bilareja is known for these magnificent houses with underground levels and incredible mosaics. And these would just be covered with feet of water every winter. And so really, looking at the critical aspect of drainage is so important, and infrastructure as just one measure, as the existing infrastructure, even if it was a Roman site with wonderful hydrology, it's just not sufficient anymore based on what we're dealing with at the moment. And as with Paphos, these sites are also facing increased duration of rains and more frequent, quote, infrequent climatic occurrences, which will create deleterious effects on all of the fragile material remains. So I mentioned that these houses have these wonderful underground mosaics, and in a couple of them, a number of them, actually, they have been previously lifted and relayed on reinforced concrete. So flooding and the resulting oxidation of that rebar and the expansion will result in the destruction of these mosaics. So these are really, really incredibly susceptible to any kind of water event or standing water. And it will probably on historic mortars as well, and plasters. And this problem of mosaics being lifted and relayed on reinforced concrete is not just there. It's an incredibly huge problem throughout the Mediterranean region on archaeological sites. It was a common conservation practice for decades to do that, to lift mosaics and relay them back on site on this sort of reinforced concrete with iron rebar. And so there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of these mosaics throughout the Mediterranean region. And so obviously any kind of water event is going to create such a huge risk to these fragile remains. And so all of this really leads me to the second activity that the Getty's taking on and planning. And this is, we're really kind of referring to it as an experts meeting or symposium, focusing on climate change and archaeological heritage in the Mediterranean region, particularly the Eastern Mediterranean region. And the objective of this meeting is to bring together experts in the field from the science side and the heritage side, and really bring them together for a discussion about the problems in the region, of course, but also what are the possible solutions. And we know that it's site specific, but what are the solutions, especially focusing on the risks of these sites in this region, and what are some actionable next steps? What are some real practical steps we can take next to really, work together and to move the research in this area forward? And so that's all I wanted to say today, but I'm certainly looking forward to some questions and discussion later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Our final piece of this group will be Nelly Robles. So Ariana, if you would take the video.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank US ICOMOS for inviting me to this symposium. I feel really honored to be part of this. I am from Mexico. My name is Nelly Robles Garcia, and I am a member of ICOMOS Mexico and Vice President of ICAM at ICOMOS. And I also want to say before that this discussion, what I am going to say, is part of a long time discussion that I have been having with my colleague Francisco Lopez Morales, who is one of the leading minds behind the World Heritage in Mexico. So this is part of our discussions. Saying that, I will start transmitting you some of our ideas on the threats of the World Heritage sites and the World Heritage Convention that we have not only in Mexico, but mainly in the Latin American and Caribbean area, and above all in the world. So thinking that UNESCO was born on November 16 of 1945, just right after the end of World War II, there were 44 founding countries of the cooperation organization created with the aim of promoting international understanding through education, science, and culture. Mexico was indeed part of this pioneering group, with a delegation headed by the then Secretary of Education, Mr. Jaime Torres Bodet, and other members of the public administration. On that occasion, a list of demands was drafted for the constituent meeting to address core issues such as education for peace and the need for a mechanism to protect the cultural heritage of nations. At the same time, Torres Bodet demanded not a simple body of intellectual cooperation, but an organization dedicated to educational and cultural questions that will privilege at first decisive aid for the reconstruction of the countries devastated by the armed conflict. At that time, it was imperative to propose the integral concept of an education for peace, for freedom, and for justice. At the first session of the conference, Torres Bodet delivered an emotional speech on UNESCO and the integration of the man of the future, in which he presented his broad vision of a wider world beyond Europe's borders and expressed the need to rebuild what the war had destroyed. He also pointed out the urgency of including in the agenda the needs of peoples forgotten by history in order to overcome the backwardness that for centuries had kept them on the sidelines of technical, scientific, and educational advances. All this has fostered from 1972 until today a growing attention of governments, private initiative, civil society, international governmental and non-governmental governmental organizations aimed at the dissemination of these principles through the support of the UNESCO list system. In this long period of experimentation and implementation of the convention, we have witnessed the growing threats hanging over heritage sites, something that has to do with rapid urbanization, environmental degradation, natural disasters, climate change, and the extraordinary growth of mass tourism that sometimes seems to suffocate communities and goods. We also seen the resurgence of armed conflicts in various parts of the world and have witnessed violence against defenseless populations and the destruction of their cultural heritage. These are the cases of the city of Aleppo in Syria, inscribed on the World Heritage List, or what is happening in Kiev and other cities of Ukraine in the heart of Europe in this very moment. From historic centers, monuments, universities, to museums, the ferocity of war threatens to erase the memory of people. The sites are not renewable resources. They must be conserved, they must be taken care of, they must be defended with continuous action that takes into account the added value of the identity involvement of communities in the process of management, monitoring, and conservation. This is the best way to create a strong link between the social body and the goods that represent it, and is the starting point to rebuild the violated identity, the sense of belonging, the will to dialogue as an instrument to knowledge, recognition, and peace. Much work has been done by UNESCO in the world. Much work still needs to be done. Above all, mistakes must be corrected to consolidate the commitment with the international community to maintain a constant and daily relationship on the subject of good practices on the management and cultural heritage. In the last 20 years, in the context of the Intergovernmental Committee, a very important space has been reserved for discussion with the young generations of experts, academics, and members of the communities who have made a significant contribution to the study of UNESCO's issues. However, there was no balance in the different regions in the same organization in the world. So it is necessary to strengthen this program, which will become the platform for the future of the convention, the bridge between the past and what we want to make a reality in the future of cultural heritage and its peculiar capacity to become a point of convergence, exchange, and dialogue between people. In this context, we question again, although UNESCO mandate in many cases can be considered idealistic, the truth is that idealism and pragmatism are not necessarily concepts opposed to each other, nor are moral interests and principles. The fabric of societies are fragile and very easy to tear apart. Repair and restore is difficult and takes a long time to heal, even more so when deliberate aggression against culture and cultural heritage is used as an instrument of war. Mexico ratified the World Heritage Convention in 1984, 12 years after its adoption, and registered the first cultural and natural properties in 1987. At present, this country continues to be a relevant actor in the scenario of the Latin American and Caribbean region, with 35 registered assets, of which 27 are cultural, 2 natural, and 6 mixed. At the global level, there are 53 registered properties, 896 cultural, 218 natural, and 39 mixed. Under this scenario, effort to increase a more universal dimension that goes beyond the Eurocentric vision on issues of cultural and natural heritage has been a constant in recent years, in order to generate a paradigm that better reflects the Latin American and Caribbean region. This has involved actions in search of propitious tools for the resolution of the problems that affect artistic and cultural heritages of humanity. In this context, they relate and articulate with the policies and proposals that each nation adopts in favor of the preservation, conservation, safeguarding, restoration, and dissemination of its heritage. The proper application and execution of the different international regulatory frameworks requires constant participation, study and development of concepts that comprehensively involve the way of looking at monuments and heritage sites, including territory, landscapes, and cultural itineraries, as well as new notions of restoration, conservation, protection, and safeguarding. Throughout all this time, while Mexico was serving as a member of the committee, and considering that in reality, not all the countries of the Latin American and Caribbean group assume the commitment established in the working sessions, we realized that only by forming an institutional administrative unit will it be possible to follow up in the commitments arising from the discussions. Without this strategy, it will be difficult to respond responsibly to the expectations of members and observers. In Mexico, this experience led the National Institute for Anthropology and History to institute the Dirección de Patrimonio Mundial, or the World Heritage Direction, whose functions allow the development of different capacities around the attention of nodal issues of World Heritage. Through this agency, we have the opportunity to undertake a more open dialogue that we have in the past, and also to find it in criticism and self-criticism, the spaces to converge passion, recognition, and action. The recognition of cultural space offers the promise of innovating our ability to live, not only in the world of economics, but also in the world as a common habitat made of the cultural and the natural. We cannot remain undaunted about the issues that have not been recognized as problems, but that today are relevant as the essence of the problem surrounding cultural rights. It must be recognized that culture plays a preponderant role in political decisions, in initiatives linked to the economic and financial factors, and that social reforms are more likely to succeed if they are articulated with the cultural perspectives. It is not a coincidence that in recent years, the inseparable relationships between culture and development has gained significant relevance in the world. The World Conference on Cultural Policies, or Mondiacult, recently held in Mexico City, provided the basis for considering a renewed approach to culture, seen as the basis for identity and social development. This undoubtedly is our best hope to continue in the path traced by the World Heritage Convention. Thank you very much.
So that was interesting to hear report from Nelly in Mexico. Ernie and John, if you want, and Leslie, please come back on. You'll be spotlighted and we can have a little bit of a conversation. I would, even though Nelly didn't mention it specifically, I should remind people that may not know that Big Bend National Park in the US is on the World Heritage tentative list. And the Pinacate Reserve in Mexico is already a World Heritage Site across the border from Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, now separated by a very stupid, ugly wall. And that should be removed. Leslie, I had the pleasure of spending a week this last summer on Sicily, Siracusa and Ortigia specifically, which on the surface looks to be pretty well armored from the effects of sea level rise, at least in the near future. But that would be from an ignorant perspective on the kind of technical knowledge that you're referring to. I wonder if you would comment on that part of the Mediterranean, if it's within the scope of work that you've done.
Yeah, thank you, Destry. It's actually not within my geographical scope, so I would be hesitant to comment specifically on that site in particular. And but I think Italy has always been, I don't want to say, at the forefront of a lot of conservation action. And it's actually heartening to hear that they are taking concrete steps to mitigate the impact of climate change on their sites. They've been doing some other interesting things throughout the country. But I hesitate to comment specifically on that side, which I don't know particularly well.
That's fine.
Mhm.
So John and Ernie, we talked, you may have heard a conversation in this morning's session regarding the fact, and you obviously know the fact that the World Heritage Convention by itself does not impose a legal restraint on BLM or the Forest Service, even though it would appear in treaty terms to be an obligation on the part of the country. I know that NPCA has worked for many years to try to get some standard of federal consistency for park protection built into federal statute. Do you see any opportunity or occasion or anything that we as a country should do? And I'm thinking here specifically for World Heritage Sites, given the potential power of the treaty, as you know, in conjunction with the Park Service Organic Act. Any thoughts on that?
Ernie, do you want to offer anything first?
Well, what I would offer is, first of all, Destry, I'm sorry I didn't participate in this morning's session, so I missed that conversation. But I would say what we're working on at Chaco right now, it has been a really robust, collaborative, inclusive process to identify a sort of a buffer area around Chaco. And I see that as a model and maybe a precedent that we could see applied to other World Heritage Sites that have resources or are connected to resources immediately outside the boundaries. We're discussing something very similar to that at Carlsbad, in fact, right now, because of the connection to the cave and karst geography. And a lot of that cave system has not been completely mapped out. And for all we know, cave and karst stuff outside the boundaries of Carlsbad Caverns National Park are directly connected to the caverns inside the park. So we're looking at and doing some mapping right now to look at what would be a reasonable area to consider permanently withdrawing oil and gas development. And around Chaco and the Permian Basin around Carlsbad, oil and gas is really the greatest threat right now that we see. So that's my thought about it. Is, we've got some good ideas, and if we can make them work, then this is something we can build on.
So have either of you seen any indication from any other federal agency than the Park Service of their acknowledgement or willingness to take into account in their actions the fact that World Heritage Sites abut their lands? Obviously, in the case of Chaco, that World Heritage Site extends onto BLM lands because it includes a number of the outlying areas as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Most of them don't.
At Carlsbad, part of the boundary is not completely surrounded by BLM, but there's Forest Service as well. And the Forest Service is currently undergoing an administrative mineral withdrawal, like what Secretary Haaland proposed for around Chaco. For Chaco, it's a temporary stopgap. For the Carlsbad area and the Lincoln National Forest, they're renewing a 20-year moratorium. So they, at some point in the past, before I was involved, they recognized that connection of the cave and karst geography to the park. And they proactively removed that from oil and gas development.
Yeah. John, or Ernie, either, do you see whether do you think there would be a benefit to World Heritage if those agencies beyond the Park Service were tasked to complete heritage impact assessments along, if the Park Service manages World Heritage Sites, they have a requirement to do periodic reporting on the condition of that place. But the heritage impact assessment concept goes beyond the boundary of the World Heritage Site. Do you think there would be a willingness on the part of BLM or the Forest Service or the Army Corps to engage directly with the idea of a heritage impact assessment?
Ernie,
Any thoughts on that?
well, I think, this is a really intriguing discussion, and I think the ripe opportunity right now in this administration is America the Beautiful. That there is a commitment in the Biden administration to really look at how can we be protecting and preserving our cultural and natural resources in the long term. And that's got to happen through collaboration. Each agency, and I think we're all pretty darn well aware that each agency has their own mission. But at the end of the day, there's an expectation by the American public as to how and what these places should be. And so I think that we have the opportunity outside of the government to help drive that decision. There's the law, and then there's its implementation. And so while the agencies have to sort of follow their policies, we can really make sure that there's an integration of that. And I think this is a really intriguing idea that Ernie, we should take back.
Mm-hmm.
There's clear evidence that that's already happening in a number of places, and examples where when it does, things work so much better. And there's less of those interagency fighting, and where you don't, and there's clear places where it's not happening, and we have real challenges with what's going to happen with the added effects of climate.
Yeah. So Leslie, have you had a chance to look at the question that Michael Dong has in the Q&A? Basically, if the fires and the climate change events have changed the conservation management plans in these areas where you've been working, or if the plans have changed as a result of those specifically, those events?
I don't know if specifically those events have changed, but I think in summary, all of the events that we've been seeing have just reinforced maybe the need to make climate change a real focus of our conservation and management plan, as I said, which we really haven't done in the past. So I think the fires and seeing some of the other erosion and of course like other elements, the bigger storms, the bigger rains that they've been having, just reinforces it really, that it's a very critical part and it's a very important part of any plan now that we do for archaeological sites. And it really needs to be the focus.
Okay. Arlene Fleming asks whether BLM and the Forest Service have to comply with NEPA. And the simple answer is yes, of course, but their attitude is that the extent of their analysis and the extent of the alternatives that they look at don't extend to adjacent national parks. That has been their attitude for decades, until something forces them to do otherwise. Climate change may begin to move in that direction. I would like to see the fact of these places being World Heritage Sites force them to move in that direction, which is why I brought up the question of the heritage impact assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this World Heritage Sites provide just another opportunity to remind the agencies that better coordination will result in better outcomes. And so the Park Service has its limitations and can only go so far. But these other agencies do need to deliver on those resource protection efforts. And so, I don't know enough about how all that reporting happens for the Park Service, but I would hope that the administration could make that change quickly and swiftly.
Yeah. So the flip side of that is sort of another question: do the management plans developed by the World Heritage Sites, in this case the parks, do they address coordination with other federal agencies? And they do address, in the sense that the Park Service talks about their actions as it may relate to adjacent agencies, but they have no ability to entice or coerce the adjacent agencies to comply with their management plan. That's the problem. And that would be part of the solution, is to, actually, we're going to hear some more about this from John Fowler in the next panel. Part of the solution would be to find a way, using the fact of this treaty that the entire US government as party to induce or require by regulation or executive order agencies to comply with the management requirements, protection requirements of World Heritage Sites. That doesn't exist. And the Park Service, in the 19 World Heritage Sites that it manages, has no such ability. We heard from the governor of Taos Pueblo earlier yesterday that they have used the fact of their World Heritage designation with both the FAA and the Forest Service to cajole them into supporting the preservation of both natural quiet from the extended runway or Forest Service practices on adjacent lands, ancestral landscapes of Taos. But it hasn't been something that they were required to do. They have been willing enough to do it out of respect for the Taos people. But there's no regulatory obligation, which is something that federal agencies respond to more readily for better or worse. Let's see, Leslie, you can look at this from a bit of an international perspective, I think, not necessarily just the Mediterranean. Do you see, have in mind any examples around the globe where the managing agency of a World Heritage Site has the ability to engage adjacent agencies or ownerships to take action to protect the qualities, the OUVs of those World Heritage Sites?
Yes, yes, I think that's a good question. From my experience working just in the area, for example, I mentioned Cyprus and Greece actually being very active in this area right now, and they've formed different consortiums within Europe, but also specifically kind of but as well, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The various country governments have formed consortiums to address climate change in general, not just for heritage, but heritage is a part of it, those sort of like larger collaborative initiatives. And Greece in particular has really taken, kind of a leadership role in this from what I, can understand, really working with other governments, other countries in the region, and focusing on the specific problems in the Eastern Mediterranean region, for example.
Yeah.
So there is I think more and more collaboration between the countries. Within the countries themselves, it's harder for me to say. I'm sure there is. I can't think right now of a specific example, except for, again, perhaps maybe Italy, where different organizations have sort of come together, arts organizations, natural heritage organizations, et cetera. But I'm sure they're not the only example.
Yeah. Aaron Adams has commented, I don't know if you've seen it, Ernie, in the chat. You may very well know him. Talking about the Chaco providing information to the BLM and BIA resource management plan regarding the potential impacts on park resources, which is fine and appropriate. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will respond affirmatively toward recommendations from outside sources, outside their own agency.
Mhm.
Ernie, also, Michelle Duong has another question about the extent of impacts from the oil and gas leases that are out there and active on biodiversity in the area surrounding in the lands where those leases are occurring, which is mostly BLM lands. Any thoughts on those impacts direct to the sites where the oil and gas activity is occurring?
Yes, thanks. Thanks to both these questions. Regarding, that's another process I didn't get into in my presentation, but it's an ongoing process regarding the BLM Farmington District Resource Management Plan, which is currently underway. We've seen the draft, we commented on it. We're waiting for the final resource management plan. In the draft, the BLM's preferred alternative would have essentially allowed leasing and wells developed right up to the boundary of the park. So I think you're right. Like all of these plans will probably end up in a fight. Ultimately, we'll see what the final looks like. But the process is underway. So
very good.
And I agree that legislation or an executive order to make sure that BLM and Forest Service are engaged with World Heritage sites on collaborative planning, that makes the most sense. But even without that, things shift, things change. And we're seeing that happening right now with BLM around Chaco, with our current secretary who oversees both those agencies. And so hopefully that will lead us in a good direction. And then regarding the biodiversity question, yes, you're right. It's shocking. It really is shocking to see the extent of that development. And to be completely honest, part of the reason for the 10-mile buffer zone is because that is the area that has been least impacted so far. And in addition to the cultural resources that are still there, still intact, still potential for being saved, that's where we have the greatest biodiversity. And you wouldn't think it looking at that landscape, but there's a very healthy elk herd that lives in the area. And it's shocking to see a big bull elk next to Pueblo Bonito. but I've seen them in the park before. So it's a buffer area, and it'll help protect the biodiversity as well as all the other landscape and natural and cultural landscape values. And then beyond that, I think we're just looking at many, many years of reclamation and restoration work to restore that landscape.
Right. Well, I don't see any more comments or questions in the Q&A or chat. Leslie, John, Ernie, I think unless you have anybody have a closing comment, we do have a couple of minutes.
Sorry, if you don't mind, I actually
Please.
would like to add on something I said previously, if we have just a couple minutes.
Yeah, go.
It was just regarding your previous question about sort of collaborations between agencies, and I just wanted to mention, after I finished speaking, I recalled, of course, the work at Paphos, near Paphos, and how, because the nature values are so important to the site there, that there has been, and there is continuing to be, a lot of collaboration with national organizations. For example, Paphos actually was a Natura 2000 site. And one of our aims with the conservation plan is actually to bring more of those, not necessarily governmental agencies, but other local nonprofits involved in nature. For like BirdLife, it's an important site for migratory birds, and really bring in all of those stakeholders and have more of a collaborative investment in preserving the values of the site, particularly on the nature side. So that's really a main goal of ours there.
Good. And I see Doug Comer has his hand up. Doug, come on and tell us what you think.
A thought listening to this conversation, what Ernie has to say about, that Chaco land being turned into an industrial landscape. And it's ironic, at least, that the industrial landscape has to do with energy extraction, which is, of course, contributing greatly to climate change. I don't know if anybody's had the idea of, not naming World Heritage landscapes as energy-free or extractive industry-free zones. There's the immediate impact that Ernie's been talking about to the World Heritage landscape itself, but there's also this cumulative effect that we don't really want to be seen as contributing to. And I'm not sure I've ever heard that suggestion before, that this might be something that would be appropriate for a resolution, that we don't want energy extraction industries to move into World Heritage zones, or within a certain radius of the zone. Just a thought, listening to the conversation.
Very good. I have to close with this. I've said this to Ernie before. My greatest failure as a lobbyist for NPCA in the 70s and 80s was that after the Clean Air Act amendments passed in '78 that authorized all existing national parks and monuments. First, the national parks would be classified as Class 1 air quality areas for no deterioration. My national monuments could be reclassified as Class 1, initially as Class 2. And in 1980, the New Mexico delegation effectively succeeded in changing the name of Chaco from National Monument to National Historical Park, specifically to prevent it being reclassified as a Class 1 area, because as we've seen, there were no specific oil and gas developments at that time, or they were first coming in, but the kind of density of oil and gas that Ernie showed on his map, would never be allowed in a Class 1 area. So I failed. But you guys aren't failing in your work, so keep it up. And we thank you for your participation and for the good work you're all three doing. We're going to take a short break before the next panel and come back precisely at, well, maybe a little before 3:15, since we're 3 minutes ahead of schedule. So thanks, guys. Leslie, thank you, ma'am. And we'll see you all around the World Heritage of the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Destry.
Thank you very much.